National Endowment for Liberty presents At Issue, the in-depth forum on freedom in America today. Hello, I'm Mike Hayes. The host of At Issue is the physician, author, and former member of Congress, Ron Paul. Ron?
Thank you, Mike. Today we're going to look at the most feared agency in the government, the Internal Revenue Service. And we'll try to decide if there's any hope of reform or if, as long as we have big government, we'll have big problems with its tax collectors.
Our program today will consist of our probe report on what's at issue, reactions from a group of average citizens somewhere in the country, and a very special analysis of the entire subject by Ron and his special guest, the noted economist Walter Williams. We'll begin our probe report, the IRS and the taxpayers' rights, following this brief message.
This is one in a series of programs that takes a fresh look at critical issues affecting how you live and how you use your natural rights as an individual to make decisions about your life. At Issue is brought to you by the National Endowment for Liberty because we agree with Thomas Jefferson that government governs best that governs least. The National Endowment for Liberty is a non-profit, non-partisan educational project. We do not accept state or federal funds. In fact, we don't count on any agency of government at any level to keep this program on the air. Instead, we count on the generous gifts of individuals, people just like you. Write to us at Post Office Box 580099, Houston, Texas 77058, or call us at 1-800-333-3545 and ask for extension 909. If you missed any part of this message, keep your pencil and paper handy. This information will be repeated.
Of all the many agencies of the U.S. government, surely none has a poorer reputation among the people than the one whose headquarters is housed in this building, the Internal Revenue Service. Of course, a tax collection agency probably cannot ever hope to be popular, but the IRS problem is compounded by reports over the years of heavy-handed, repressive tactics that fly in the face of the Constitution and the people's expectations of ordinary human rights. It all started so innocently, in an innocent year, 1913. 1 month before Woodrow Wilson would take office with his progressive mandate, the 16th Amendment to the Constitution would be ratified, and the means to pay for all that progressivism would be at hand. At first, it was just a little bitty tax, and only the rich would pay at all. In fact, the other tariff revisions in the first income tax bill were considered much more significant. But several wars, new deals, and great societies later, how it has grown.
If you look at some of the people that opposed the amendment, they made predictions that at the time seemed nonsensical. And today, you can obviously see that much of what they said has come true.
As the tax rate grew and grew, so did the IRS, and so did troubling reports of abuses of IRS power.
Every hearing we had, you could bring in examples of the monstrous misuse of government authority that amounted to nothing more than intimidation because you had the taxpayer didn't know what their rights were and they were just scared to death.
I believe that in both spirit and substance, our tax system has come to be un-American.
Many had hoped that Ronald Reagan, with his anti-IRS rhetoric and lower tax platform, would curb IRS abuses. But it didn't happen, and the big reason was the runaway federal deficit.
The budget deficits have not only put more pressure on the Congress, they put more pressure on the IRS, and it's giving much more in the way of resources to the IRS. Congress has been much more willing during the 1980s to give the IRS more money and more power.
We had members of the United States Congress, legislators, who were even leery or possibly afraid of retaliation by or from the IRS for passing legislation which would rein in their power, which would actually put into law the rights and the responsibilities of the taxpayer.
You think there were members of Congress who themselves were intimidated by the IRS?
No question in my mind.
If the IRS has the power to intimidate congressmen, aren't they even a greater threat to an ordinary citizen?
In certain instances, it certainly was true. If a prominent doctor in a small town was brought up on charges of income tax evasion, everybody in town knew about it. If a judge or other prominent citizen in a town was brought up, the word spread very rapidly. And let's face it, that does make people stop and think twice.
What the IRS does can have tragic personal consequences for families. A family that can't meet a mortgage payment or pay the grocery bills, or indeed a small business that goes under. Those are terrible human costs. And all too often, it seems the IRS doesn't take those costs into account.
One case, a 10-year-old child, her savings account with $694 in it was attached because her father owed $1,000 in back taxes. Well, we got that straight, but that should have never happened, and there were thousands of other stories like that.
An attorney who defended a newspaper in Miami going to jail for 3 or 4 months when he shouldn't have gone to jail for so much as a minute. A woman in North Carolina whose husband was forced to commit suicide because the IRS essentially drove him out of business even though they didn't owe a dime. I mean, there are cases that are truly heart-rending about what the IRS has done to people.
My gosh, you've had people that have lost their lives in some cases. You've had a woman in Alaska that she decided she was going to challenge the IRS, and she sat down in a car they were trying to grab and pushed the plugs on the door so they couldn't open it. Gee, they went and got tire irons and bashed the windows in, dragged her through the glass. I mean, they can be very rough. And it isn't just George Hansen saying this. This has been on 60 Minutes and some of the, the big national publications.
Through his book and video productions, Hansen's foundation has exposed many cases of abuse. In one, the IRS sought back taxes from a Detroit area daycare center.
They violated their own arrangement, went into the center, captured it, so to speak, herded all the children into a room, set up a collection station at the entrance, and they basically gave the parents, when they came later in the day, the idea they couldn't take the child home till they sat down and wrote a check out to the daycare center so that the IRS could confiscate that check.
Is this kind of outrage just the result of some overzealous individual agents, or is the problem systemic?
It's systemic. And the reason for that is this special relationship that citizens have to the government when they're dealing with the IRS, that you have to prove that you are innocent rather than the government proving you're guilty.
Public clamor finally achieved a measure of success in 1988 when Congress passed legislation called the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights. And in the final analysis, perhaps the problem is more fundamental than even the problem of IRS abuses.
I think it's clear the bigger the government is, the more they tax, the more power they have to use to enforce that tax. People don't naturally render money to the government. We don't have people making voluntary contributions to the federal government. So the larger the taxes, the higher the spending, the more power the government needs to get that money. And when you give lots of power to the tax collector, that's less liberty for the rest of us.
And so, for many, the problem remains. And as long as government is so big, with so many agencies and so much spending, the rights of the taxpayer surely will continue in a state of very precarious jeopardy.